connect or disconnect communities online. Bridging, for example, is one of these type of intervention.
Can you define bridging?
Bridging is when you try to design an intervention that expose people to user with opposite views or being part of a different community with the objective of increasing understanding by exposure, basically. The reasoning for our project, the paper I'm going to discuss today, was that we thought that could be a sort of proxy toward what actually we want to study. In practice, when you do this operation of connecting or disconnecting community, ultimately what happens is you change what is in the feed. You change what post is visible for the user. So we decided to take an approach where we actually go directly there and we think how we can identify what type of content can be polarizing. And today with language model, we basically have access to a lot of more powerful tools that we can address this problem and be a bit more fine-grained in defining what can be polarizing. So what we did is to take some definition from social science. There is a paper published in Science, I think a couple of years ago, that is, the PI is Rob Wheeler. Basically, they tested 25 different interventions to depolarize people. It was an offline experiment, or better, survey online, but not about social media. And they basically rank these 25 interventions from the most effective to the least effective. We took that as a reference. So we look at literature in social science, and what we did is to take 8 dimensions that they use as they measure as an impact of their intervention. And we translated that in basically a prompt for a language model, where we ask a language model, is this post expressing anything or any of this dimension, these 8 potential outcomes when the user consumes this content. Then translation in experiment was a challenging part, where there was a lot of engineering to do, that maybe we'll talk later about this. But what we did is basically creating an architecture and based on a web extension that allow us to re-rank in real time the feed of participants. So we were able to run an experiment on social media. It was with more than 1,000 participants, volunteer, that where we changed the objective of the ranking of their feed. Basically, we ran 2 experiments. In one experiment, we downrank this type of content that we identify with LLM based on these 8 dimensions. And just to clarify, these 8 dimensions are, for example, support for partisan violence, bias evaluation of political facts, or support for anti-democratic practices or candidates. And in the experiment, we downrank or uprank this content to basically change the exposure to this potentially polarizing post. And so we ran this for 1 week, 10 days in total, with 1,200 participants. And what we found is that measure both with pre and post survey. So to observe the effect of the intervention after 1 week, and measure in the feed, so to assess the momentary impact of having a different feed, we found an impact on affective polarization. So in both directions. So when we increased exposure by upranking, people reported a colder feeling toward people with the opposite view, and the other way around. We are talking about a couple of points out of 100. This is the standard instrument used to measure polarization. You ask people, how do you feel about the other party? And on a scale 0 to 100, and we observe like a couple of point change on this scale. At the same time, we saw that there is an effect on negative emotions. So people reported a change in sadness and anger. Is also with a symmetric effect, so an increase and decrease based on how we treated the participants. And one distinction, then I pass, one distinction was that affective polarization was persistent in the feed and when we measure 24 hours after the end of the intervention. Emotion actually are apparently more volatile. So they were measurable in the moment, in the feed. When we tested 24 hours later, we didn't find any effect. Basically, people didn't feel sad or angry about what they consume the day after. Yeah, I think I'm...
All right. I would point your attention to the slides where we've got QR codes, the papers that we're talking about at the top of the conversation. Naila, do you want to give us the rundown for what you found?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for this. Very interesting. So I study how social media shapes intergroup relations in deeply divided context, and specifically, how do we identify the causal mechanisms between the two, and how do we use those insights to build more constructive online environments? So I started this agenda with asking a question that we read often about is, what is the causal effect of social media? What does social media actually cause? And now this is very hard to do in terms of the research design because of the selection effect. People self-select into social media content, both in terms of how much time they spend on it and also just what they consume. So one of the designs that I started with in 2021, and there have been several deactivation experiments around that time and ever since, are deactivation experiments. What does that entail? It means you take part of 50% of the group, you randomize them into two groups, and one group remains active on social media platforms, whichever platform they're active on, and the other one gets deactivated. So you pay them to go off social media. So this paper in particular was doing this in Facebook, and I started with Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is my home country, and I was specifically wondering what happens during the week of conflict commemoration period, where there's so much conversation about the war and a lot of emotional and moral and hostile content online. I paid people to go off during this time, the other one stayed on, and then I compared the effects. I will note that in 2 years, I did the same thing in Cyprus, which also has some of the similar features, so we can talk about that. And what I find is that in Bosnia specifically, having people go off of social media actually led to worse outgroup attitudes, but specifically driven by those in ethnically homogeneous offline communities, right? So they're the ones driving the effects. And what's the story there? That going off, you know, we oftentimes imagine it's this beautiful space, but also offline, there's a lot of hostility, and it may have pushed them even further into these offline echo chambers. Now, I want to point that this is not an argument for letting platforms off the hook in any way. It is just pointing to what I think is the key variable of thinking about also what are the opportunities for constructive intergroup engagement in the offline spaces as well. Now I'm running this study, these deactivation studies with a team at NYU and Georgetown in 24 countries around the world, where we are deactivating people from 5 social media platforms and then estimating the effects of intergroup attitudes on news knowledge, on subjective well-being, and so on. And these are all different outcomes and different dynamics. So I'm excited about our ability to get a little bit deeper into the different contextual circumstances that may be shaping the effect of social media usage. Now, this is also precisely where algorithmic design comes into place, because if we understand the effects under which online exposure might be constructive, then we can build algorithms that increase that, right? Some of the algorithms that you were talking about. And I have a second line of work that speaks to that, so I'll mention it briefly, which is, again, isolating this feed design on a custom platform. So we have, in February, I had around 1,200 Democrats and Republicans have conversations about policy relevant topics within different feeds. So one feed was pushing up content that reaches cross-group agreement between the groups. One made partisan identities more salient, and one was just chronological, so in the order in which people were posting. And it's really fascinating to see how the behavior changes. So when you start pushing common ground and incentivizing those sort of messages, people also tend to use more nuanced, more hedged language. They say more, I think, it may be, and so on. And then when you make partisan visibility stronger, then you see an increase in more partisan hostile content, if you will, which is all to say that algorithms really do have a strong effect also on how people speak, not just what they see. So what does this all add up to? And we'll have time to unpack all of these three. First one is that offline opportunities matter enormously. And again, this is not to let the platforms off the hook, but if we think about polarization overall, we also want to be investing in opportunities in the offline space so that when people are off the feed or social media platform, they're going into something that's constructive versus going into sometimes even more hostile communities. The second one is that not all algorithms are equal. Clearly, there are better options than engagement optimizing designs. And there has been a lot of—
Can you define engagement for us?
Yes, engagement is optimizing for the time spent or for the numbers of likes, shares, and so on, which is at the core what current mechanisms and are, because of course that is what is good for business, right? Having more people on these platforms and having them clicking is what they're optimized for. But we have a lot of other better designs, and I think now we're at this point where we can think about, okay, how do we actually make them into practice? And I know some of the platforms are already starting to think about that and providing users opportunities to have these different platform designs, which I'm particularly excited about. And I think that the last point that I want to make is that these are not quick fixes. Sometimes we are disappointed by the small coefficient size, or, it's just 1% on this 100% scale and so on. But it took so long to build the current information system environment, and it's going to take a long time also to rebuild it. So I think if we, think about these small changes compounding over time, I think that is, yes, a more hopeful take.
Yeah, thank you both for giving a quick overview. I guess I wanted to flag that we'll have Q&A at the end. So as you have questions, we'll pass around some mics. So just please hold those in your brain for a little while. I think like one of the things I'm really excited about for putting these papers in conversation is how it speaks to the multidimensional nature of the problem. Right? It's algorithms and what's happening offline. I think both your papers point to those different dimensions of social media and polarization. Nayla, you talked about algorithmic design and needing more alternatives. Tiziano, your paper explores what those alternatives could look like, and we'll get into that. So you found in your paper, Tiziano, that re-ranking can reduce affective polarization, while Nayla, you found that deactivation can worsen ethnic attitudes towards ethnic outgroups in Bosnia. Could maybe you two, I want to invite you two to comment on each other's papers and what you think that they imply about our understanding of social media and polarization. I think I would love to get them in conversation. So whatever you'd like to say, I think we'll be curious to hear.
Yeah, I'm happy to start us on that. I think we approach it with different angles. I think they're very much consistent with one another, right? So Tiziano's paper is very much different algorithmic feeds. So what happens when you're online and what are these different two options? Mine is sort of what happens when you go offline entirely. So thinking about the entire ecosystem. I will say that as I mentioned, I did a study in Bosnia, then I replicated it in Cyprus. And in Cyprus, there was a null effect. And when you think about the context, it makes sense. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, there's basically no linguistic difference between the ethnic groups, so the space is very different than in Cyprus, where between Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots, right, there's very little communication online. There's much larger linguistic barriers, so taking them off didn't really make a big difference in terms of their just intergroup attitudes, which again makes sense when we think structurally about these barriers. But I did a follow-up in Cyprus where I encouraged participants to spend 2 weeks engaging with the outgroup content in their language on non-political topics as well, topics that they're interested in. And I find very positive effects in terms of outgroup attitudes in doing so, right? And that speaks to this question of what may a more constructive engagement be and the importance of being exposed to the outgroup and particularly the things that you might have in common, right? And we can think about then algorithmically, what does that look like? So Tiziano is in this paper focusing on the content, right? So you're sort of downranking this non-democratic and hostile content. The other piece is bridging, which is exactly sort of what I find would be very beneficial because people who were actually engaging with the content of the outgroup, they're the one reporting the most positive content, right? So from that perspective, I think they're aligned. But again, because they're looking at different pieces of the puzzle, what happens just online in your example, or mine that takes into account also the offline environment, our results, when you read them at first, might seem like there's like their intention. And again, I want to say that going back to the Bosnia piece, the effects were driven specifically by those in ethnically homogeneous communities, right? And this is a time where on TV, in offline spaces, there are also a lot of hostility. So again, yes, that is sort of my read of our papers getting at these different.
Yeah, I see. Going back to the algorithmic design, the connection.
Could you lean into your mic just a little bit?
Yeah, the connection I see is so it would be not accurate to say that social media is bad in general. Social media has some positive effect. The paper Nela shows that there is some positive effect. There is some literature showing that it's beneficial for to mitigate loneliness, to mitigate other type of potential harms. The other side of the spectrum is pure engagement that is harmful as well. And then we have this space in the middle that is basically where the design space that we explore with our paper. And there we have a lot of opportunities. We can design algorithms that are better than the extreme because we have a full control of what content we want to promote on social media. This is one point. Another point I want to make is that the two papers basically highlight how complex the situation is. There is no easy answers for social media. For example, there is a concept called temporal validity that is basically, does it reproduce if you try multiple times the same experiment? One different paper that we have is not on polarization, is on mental health. But just to give you an understanding of the complexity of running this type of experiments, is we run an experiment where we remove negative content, like negative emotions from social media for 1 month. And we run it 3 times. We run it before the election, during the election, and after the election. Basically, what we found is that the only consistent result was improvement of life satisfaction. But when we run it during the election time, all the metric of well-being moved. So removing negativity during the week of the election, basically we saw an effect on anxiety, depression, and all the metrics that we tested. So there is also a challenge in the context where you test, like at the cultural context, the time when you test, and so there is not a single answer that you can give with one study. And what is the solution? I think that the only way is to create some mechanism that can have some regular assessment, so some regular auditing of the system. And I think the research community should go there, should build tools that can run independent auditing of the system constantly. And our work going in that direction, but I see that there is a lot of work emerging trying to tackle this problem.
Yeah, I think both these papers together, as I think it's been a theme in the conversation so far, just highlight the complexity of the problem, right? And so we had a call before this, prepare for this panel, and we talked for a little while about how there's always a question of like, what is the one design that's the best for social media? And the reality might be that there are different designs that have to fluctuate over time. Like Tiziano's paper took place during a high-profile intense election. Nela's during a genocide remembrance week. Like the environment fluctuates, so the effect of social media or like the design that would be the best for people or for society, it changes over time. But I guess I want to maybe later in the conversation talk a little bit about how things could be better, how they could be different. But before we get there, I want to focus on the status quo. Like what do algorithms look like today? And so Tiziana, like, to start with you, your study suggests that downranking polarizing content slightly reduces engagement and emotional negativity. Does this suggest that algorithms systematically amplify, like algorithms designed to maximize engagement, systematically amplify polarizing negative content? And if so, what might be the effects of that long-term for democratic health?
So yes, we saw an effect on engagement. So when we reduced the polarizing content, there was people spent less time on the platform. But it's not black and white. It's a bit more complex. Specifically, when we increase, there was no actual effect. When we decrease, we saw less time, but people engage more with the content that they saw. So in a way, it seems that the content that was in their feed was perceived as better quality, of a better quality. There's more engagement, more reposting. So it's, again, we are entering the space of, it's a complex answer, a complex question. And in practice, our study could not really measure amplification on social media because we didn't test the difference between the engagement base that we were investigating and technological. So we didn't have this exact comparison. In my intuition, I have to say, looking at the data, is not in the paper, but looking at the data, is that during that time, there was a lot of negativity, even in the chronological based. It was, Twitter was really in a bad place in that week. So I think in practice, that would also align with some work. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Meta. They ran a study, some research in collaboration with Meta during the 2020 election, where they compare the engagement base with a chronological base algorithm. So they put half people into engagement, half people into chronological. What they found is basically there was no effect. This would kind of align also with what we saw, that there was a lot of negative content, even in the chronological base. So people just tend to follow people that produce also negative content. But what I want to say is that there is a good news for me in this, is that with the algorithmic design, we have degree of freedom. So we can make better feed that are better, even better than the chronological version. So there is it's not about try to fix that, but we can completely redesign the feed in a way that is better than, as I said earlier, than the two extremes. In terms of what can happen long term, yes, I think there is enough evidence, not from our specific work, because we focus only on 24 hours, but there is enough evidence that this constant negative consumption of content can create negative attitudes, so can really shift toward more extreme positions. In our specific case, we measure 24 hours after, so I cannot say more than 24 hours after the end of the intervention. But I want to say that it's still very critical for democracy, even assuming that this is the result, that is, it lasts for a short time. I believe it's more, but let's assume it's only 24 hours. There are a lot of situations where democracy really can be affected in 24 hours, like Brexit happened in 24 hours. So even if this type of change impacts people on a short time, it's extremely important anyway. So we should be really worried of what algorithm could do us.
Would you say, just to follow up, that an implication of your study and your broader research is that algorithmic design should be responsive to changes in the environment? 'Cause I think your point about we're in the middle of an election, it's very negative, very polarizing. Your feed is overwhelmed with highly political, highly salient content. Is it maybe desirable for a platform to consider that in how they're deploying their algorithm?
Yeah, I believe that a platform should take this into account. The challenge is how to keep them accountable for that. We saw yesterday the lawsuit that, yeah, where if you didn't see it, basically Meta and Alphabet basically had to pay 3 million, I think, for some harm they made with engagement algorithm they implemented. So there may be that path, but we are at a very early stage, so we don't know where this is going. Other ways to think how to enforce this is more from the customer side, so customer rights sides. We could consider from the customer perspective how to make sure that these are not these algorithms are not harmful, and that this would be a different path that doesn't go through legislation but through the customer right route.
That's I think that's very insightful, and I want to talk to you a little bit later about maybe kind of building trust in those mechanisms for changing algorithms if we have time. But Neil, I want to move to you. I think when we talk about algorithms, it's easy to compare, like, oh, if the algorithm was designed this way, if the algorithm was designed that way, it would have this effect. Like, we also have to think about that social media has offline consequences, right? And one of the things I find really fascinating about your study is how it draws attention, I think very specifically to a key offline consequence, which is what social media, time on social media takes away. You know, or when you're not using social media, what more time do you spend on different activities? So in your study, you write that after the study participants deactivated Facebook in Bosnia, you wrote that Facebook deactivation increased the amount of time that users spent with family and friends in reading the news on online sources. And so I wanted to ask you, to what extent are the effects of social media use on polarization and subjective well-being, another kind of outcome that you looked at, driven by this displacement of online activities?
Absolutely. I think to a huge extent, and I would argue that we're not paying enough attention to it. Now, I want to, before I go into this, say that this really depends on what outcomes we're optimizing. So two other things that we looked into the study is the effects on subjective well-being and news knowledge. And they're consistently across the activation studies, going off of social media improves your self-reported well-being. People report feeling less anxious, less lonely, and so on. They also report less news knowledge, right? And on polarization, it depends, right? So we want to be very precise when we're talking about social media effects, which outcome we're trying to optimize for. And sometimes it's easy to lose that in this conversation. I think substitution matters very much. And again, these two problems can coexist, right? We should be focusing on better online algorithms and also better offline opportunities so that when people go off, they have more spaces where they can constructively engage with the outgroup, and again, better opportunities for intergroup engagement. As you noticed, in Bosnia, and I found that in Cyprus too, people report spending more time with friends and family, but also watching TV, right? And if you're watching TV and reading the online news during this period, it's not like content there is particularly positive and great for intergroup relations, right? So what is happening on the TVs? What is happening in the communities? Again, this is not shifting blame. It is just making sure that we're really thinking about this holistically and thinking about, okay, when we're, not spending time online, are we creating opportunities for constructive intergroup engagement? So yeah, in our papers, and this was with the team at NYU, we were surprised by the results. So we looked at substitution, but I didn't really think that I'm going to find these more negative effects when you go offline. So I wish we dug even deeper into it. And I know there are papers now coming up and some deactivation experiments where they're really going very deep into what's happening when you're not using social media, and then trying to build these conditions under which we might expect a more positive or a negative effect. And that, I think now that there's many more studies, we're in a place, and when they're replicated across very different contexts, we're in a place where we can start building these conditions and a conditional knowledge, saying like, okay, when these conditions are present, we might expect a more positive effect or more negative effect and so on, and move beyond sort of this just, it's the worst thing in the world, it's the best thing in the world, to really think specifically about what outcomes we were trying to optimize. And then, yes, what are the contextual conditions within a particular place that may make one of these outcomes more or less likely.
Yeah, I really, I'm so tempted to move us to like, how could things be better? But one more question, I think, for you, Naila, to follow up. Can you maybe comment on engagement specifically? This might push a little bit beyond the bounds of your research, but if the idea is that social media can harm people by trading off with other things they do, like sleep or exercise or spend time with friends, like engagement-based designs are trying to maximize the time you spent on social media, right? So is that maybe like a key way in which algorithms designed to get you to like as much as possible, comment as much as possible, is that maybe a key way where those algorithms are harmful?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in that sense, the literature is relatively clear in my reading, which is that current algorithms optimize for engagement, time spent, clicks. What tends to be most engaging is the most moral, emotional, and conflict content. That's what people click on, and then you get into this vicious cycle of spending time in that place. And the other thing that we know, but we oftentimes forget, is that the minority of users creates the majority of content. So, and that's a big piece. So you're getting completely skewed signals that you're using to create your perceptions of the entire world. And we call that false polarization, where you think there is even more division than there actually might be. So absolutely, this is detrimental, right? So the question is, okay, what are the better online options? And I think giving users both more transparency to know how these processes go, like that seems very obvious that you should know what is being shown to you, and giving them different options. And I think Tiziana's work there is very influential of sort of figuring out, okay, these are different designs. And at the same time, as we're trying to improve that online space, thinking about, okay, how do we also make offline opportunities for constructive engagement? And if we're thinking about polarization overall, then we really need to be pushing in these both directions at the same time. And that's sort of a space for all of us, right? So this is not just a technology problem, and technologists have a big role to play in this. It is also a space for all other policymakers that can make a difference.
Indeed. And I really do wonder if so much of negativity towards tech is just because tech is designed to take away from your offline experience rather than support it, right? And I think one of the key ways that maybe technology and algorithms could be designed to be more supportive would be in our politics, right? So I want to move us a little bit to, we keep making references to how things could be better. I'll finally bring us here. So Naila, to start with you, you've both done a lot of work, and Tiziana, so feel free to jump in if you have thoughts on this question as well. But can social media be a force for depolarization? And if so, like, how do algorithms and maybe platforms more generally, how should they be designed? You've both really thought very deeply about platform design and politics. I'd be curious, like, how could they be better from that perspective?
I think we have a lot of evidence of how they can be better, right? The question is political and actual implementation.
Yeah.
Just last week, there were results from this pro-social ranking challenge, which was being started by researchers at UC Berkeley, but it's a humongous team of testing different algorithmic designs. And the results are really positive in terms of finding some algorithmic ranking choices that lead to reduced affective polarization. If I remember well, one that they noted is one that shows more ideologically diverse, credible news outlets to folks. And then the second one—
Can you give some context about what they tested, just for our audience who might be know?
Yeah, exactly. So they tested multiple ranking algorithms on Facebook, on X, and Reddit over 6 months during the 2024 election. And they were doing this on current social media platforms. And basically the whole story is, okay, how does re-ranking the content on these platforms, what effect does it have on affective polarization? And two emerged, I think, as sort of most influential, but they had this pro-social challenge, which I thought was very clever and nice of a lot of different options. And one was, yes, exposure to more, as I said, ideologically diverse, credible news. And the other one was one that downranks toxicity, so more toxic content, and upranks bridging content, right? And we talked a lot about bridging, and as we said, that means like exposing people to content that is embraced by different communities, and it depends sort of in what context you're thinking about bridging. And a lot of other people are coming up with these different rankings. As I said, I ran a study of my own on this custom platform where people were talking about policy in these different designs. And yes, when they were talking about this within a feed where the messages that received likes agrees from both, in this case, Democrats and Republicans, when that was pushed up, they started talking differently. When it was emphasized which group they're on, they immediately start speaking and writing differently, right? So I think we have a lot of, I think now design options, but then there's the question of how do we implement that from a technical standpoint, and how do we implement that from a political standpoint, and why would platforms want to do this, and thinking about what are the regulations to push them in that direction, right? That's a completely different question. But in terms of theoretically whether they could be a space for depolarization, I think absolutely. And that's sort of the space that I'm excited about and that I work in.
Yeah. That's why we have you both on this panel today. So I want to move us to thinking about how do we build trust and how do we build an evidence base for these designs. But maybe before, just real quick, Tiziana, do you have any thoughts on this question about how feeds can be depolarizing? Your study pretty explicitly looked at this, so I'd be curious.
Yeah. So. Yeah, Neil already covered quite well. In practice, yeah, we have the design space that is opening a lot with, at least from my point of view, with language models. Basically, post on social media is text. Language models are great in modeling text and understanding basically the nuance of some content. So we can really think very fine-grained interventions. I think we are at the beginning of this type of research, and we'll see a lot of more in the coming years. One thing I want to mention is that, for example, some work that we did is we have one paper that is called embedding societal value in feed ranking algorithm into social media. And there we basically try to distill this logic of how can we take constraints from social science that are well established but from a different community, and how can we bring them into feed algorithms. So how can we take a definition that is at this point known and tested, and turn it into a number that we can use for ranking. And simple version in one sentence is basically using language model, taking the definition, try to align with human judgment. So we always want to make sure that humans are in agreement with the language model, and then we can convert this into a ranking system. And this opens to an entire new space of opportunities, both from the type of intervention that you can even imagine, and also for what type of outcome you want to optimize for. You can make sure to embed not only single objective that can be algorithm, the engagement or something like this, but you can imagine a multi-objective system where you have engagement, yes, because that's something that because of the business reason you cannot really fight too much. But you can add a lot of other objectives that could be optimizing for reducing polarization or making sure that you don't have mental health risk and so on. So I think, yeah, we are in the space of we'll see a lot more of this.
So the universe is very vast. And
It's
algorithms.
I feel
That's what I take from him.
yeah, I feel I'm a computer scientist, so I feel that what happened recently with AI, it opened dramatically the set of possibility in a bad way, but also in a very good way that can be used for societal benefit.
Yeah. And so kind of on this thread, so we're talking about how design could be better and how it's kind of in theory, it's like you both have demonstrated that that's possible. But building the support for it politically and building an evidence base for that is very difficult today. Because platforms are increasingly shutting down access to data for research. And so Tiziano, I want to dwell a little bit more specifically on from like a researcher's perspective, because your paper not only does it demonstrate how things can be better, it also kind of points out a really novel way that researchers can test and deploy different designs. Like you focused on polarization for one study. You mentioned another study focused on mental health. Could you maybe just comment briefly on some of the most promising directions for how researchers can study algorithmic design using feed re-ranking and generative AI?
Yeah, so in one of the contribution of the paper was not only the findings, but it was the system that we develop around because so there is this definition I like from some scholar that call what is happening recently is an API calypso, that's API apocalypse. And the API, for who is not familiar, is the way to access data for programmatically on platforms. And what's happening is platforms are closing access to data. So it's becoming harder and harder to test intervention and test as an independent researcher alternative designs. So one of the contributions of our work was exactly how to solve this problem. So developing a system that could allow anyone to change the algorithm externally. We release open source the code, so it's available for other researchers to test and to run their own experiment. In terms of what language model, what AI can do, what I mentioned, it's opening a lot of possibilities. In addition to that, I'm going to repeat that part. I think there is also another opportunity that we saw recently, that is the development of simulation of social media. That is an interesting space. There's a paper from Chris Bale where basically the team basically work on simulating participants on social media in a political social media, let's say, and they change the algorithm and then look how this impacts people having a simulated participant. So I think that's why I'm quite optimistic on what we can do in this space. And as I said, we can really go beyond polarization. With this system, we can think about mental health, but we can also think about civic engagement, optimizing for the quality of conversation, and so on. We have really we are opening the space both in the what type of intervention and what type of outcome we can look at.
Yeah, and I think that I want to talk a little bit more about kind of experimentalism and building that evidence base. But I guess I would flag like probably a couple more questions, and we'll move to Q&A. So if you have questions, feel maybe just get ready to grab a mic in here in a minute. But Nayla, I want to move to you real quick because we talked a little bit about how earlier it's really hard to do experiments, right? Like experiments are, people call it like the gold standard of social science inquiry. You know, some people go so far as to say you can't really understand causality without it. But the impact of social media is incredibly complex and contextual. I think that's been a clear implication of our discussion today. And so communication scholars have raised concerns about the ability of a localized experiment taking place during an election in one particular jurisdiction to generalize to other contexts or to be replicable in a different context. So maybe, Naila, like on our prep call, you described yourself as an experimentalist. So I figured I would direct this question to you. Can experiments be meaningful for establishing causality when studying the interplay between social media feeds and polarization?
Yeah, I think they can, and I would flip that question and say that exactly because because of the complexity of social media, we need methods that allow us to get at the mechanisms and identify what draws that variation. But I think that criticism is very valid, but it comes from our desire to get the one effect. We ask question, what is the effect of social media? I think that's an underdefined question. The effect of which platform for which users during what particular time. And that's a less, exciting question, but that is really what we're estimating. We will never be able to get, okay, it is precisely 0.5 standard deviation is the effect of social media. So it reminds me, to me, it sounds similar as asking what is the effect of a medicine? Which medicine for whom? What is the body that we're talking about here? What I think experiments can help us do is, as we replicate them in many different contexts, we can start getting better at understanding these particular circumstances. So one experiment is not going to tell you much. For example, these deactivation studies, we are now working with a team from NYU at Georgetown at deactivations around 24 countries during sort of similar times. That's going to help me look at a little bit better at these conditions in a way that one experiment in Bosnia, in the US, or wherever really cannot speak to that. So I think we need to replicate more things across different contexts and then think about how we aggregate that knowledge. And I have to write a book by September that does so. So let's see. But I think really in replicating and in being precise in what we can actually say. Like with my study, oftentimes I read some descriptions of it that said, this study found that Facebook is good in Bosnia. This study does not speak to that at all. This study found that deactivating people during the 7 days of conflict commemoration period was bad for those in ethnically homogeneous communities. Like that is what the study can actually say. It doesn't really tell you anything about the effect of Facebook. So I think we need to be a little bit more precise with what we're getting at these studies and then how we're talking about the implications and not jump so many steps ahead.
Yeah, I really like that answer. It's more experiments in more places. I'm all for more research. So I guess maybe to conclude, we've talked a little bit about the complexity of this issue politically, right? Like it's especially maybe in a place like the United States where there's a lot of distrust of people being like, you can't say this or this is good speech. Tiziano, I wanted to ask you, how do you build trust in the mechanisms for kind of categorizing content, right? Like you have this like 8-part classification of content being like anti-democratic, being hostile, being in opposition to bipartisanship, and you use LLMs to operationalize that. Like, can we trust a large language model? I wanted to invite you to maybe comment on like how do you build that trust over time?
Yeah. So I think there are two different components, at least two different components for to build trust. One is transparency. So you want to be transparent of what is optimized. Right now, social media is a sort of black box. We know that is engagement, but we don't know what engagement is correlated with. So it's still very unclear to what we are consuming. So transparency means that for example, in our intervention, we show explicitly, we surface what are these 8 dimensions that are important to demote or promote some content. It must be evaluated with humans. That's something I want also to stress. Cannot just trust the LLMs doing something. But if there is a high correlation with human, I am more confident that, okay, it's we can use it as a classifier. We have, for example, other studies where we extended beyond this 8 dimension. We created, for example, a library of values that user can use to re-rank their feed. And this helps in increase the transparency, so people know what they are getting in their feed and what they are getting, why they're getting something. And this speaks also for me, the second principle of to build trust, that is agency. So giving the user the ability to customize and decide what they want in their feed. So not a sort of passive role for the user where platform decides everything, but giving the user the ability to pick or have control. If the user wants to see less political content, should be able to do it, and should not be on the platform to decide that. And in this study that I mentioned, where we built a library, basically we combine these two. We let user up rank or down rank on X the content that they want to see, based on these more than 70 different dimensions that they may care about. And we pick this dimension from literature about human values, community values, and societal values.
Transparency and choice. I think those are both things that people can get behind. Nayla, I guess some question to you. Do you have any thoughts on kind of building trust
so funny
across
because
divides?
if you saw
Yeah.
what I wrote, it's transparency and user choice. So I'm going to repeat
Perfect, okay.
myself a little bit. But I guess one just point on this is that also what's nice about transparency is user choice is it's something we can all agree on, right? I think transparency is not a controversial or a political question. That you should know what is being shown to you seems obvious, right? And so it's nice that that is the one that that to me seems like, yes, like something we can agree on, and then user choice. And I think the library of values is really exciting. I mean, some platforms seem to be trying to think about that, but of course there's a big gap between thinking about it theoretically and then it being the reality for all.
Yeah, there is a bit of movement from the industry in that direction. I saw on Instagram they change. It's hidden in somewhere in the setting, but you could specify what topics you want to see more or less in your feed. I think it's beta, but you can find it somewhere. I think I don't know what is Blue Sky.
Yeah.
Yes, Blue Sky of course has at the core this idea of you can build your own feed, and there is also discussion on X. But let's see, because Musk announced something, and then let's see if X will follow up on that, of basically asking Grok what content you want to see in a way that the algorithm could be adapted to your request. So there is an interest also from the industry side to go in that direction of more agency.
Okay, I think that's maybe a good note for us to conclude the main panel section. Who has questions? I think we'll have a couple mics kind of going around the room. So yeah, feel free to chime in. We've covered a lot today.
Yeah, hi, I'm Miara. I'm an MA student in Georgetown. I think yesterday there was this lawsuit that got finalized, and they found Meta and Google liable for having addictive algorithms that were catastrophic for teenagers' mental health. So my question is, what do you think the implications of these are for the social political landscape in general online? Like, are we optimistic about this? Should we be optimistic about the possible regulations this might come up with? Or do you think this is still going to be pretty much an uphill climb with the appeals process and all? So just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, that was an incredibly important moment. Whether we should be skeptical or optimistic, I love that the skepticism of the mind and optimism of the will. So that is how I'm approaching all of these questions. I think, again, I'm not a mental health specialist in any way. And I can say that from my studies, I do see that the activating going offline has all sorts of positive benefits on one's self-reported well-being. And I know this has been a very long battle for these families and for these users. And now what will happen after this? I mean, it seems that it's going to open up space for a lot more lawsuits and a lot more opportunities to have these conversations. I am optimistic that sort of thinking about these questions a little bit more, yes, analytically and skeptically, and trials are good to raise awareness. So I think these are all important moments. Yeah, I think we'll have to see what happens in the next few months. But I'm excited as you to sort of follow where this goes.
Tiziana?
It's hard to say. It's at the very beginning, but yeah, it's a big moment. It can have an impact in well beyond just mental health. So it's it can be a force for some changes in the platform design, because only the risk to be liable of what I have and what I recommend may force them to make some reconsider their design for sure.
I guess maybe wanted to flag, at KGI, we've done a lot of work on this litigation, and I think there's a lot of uncertainty about where it goes from here. But I think one underappreciated dimension of litigation is the amount of learning it will enable for the public to have about how these systems are designed. So there have been a lot of documents released publicly, and we at KGI have written about those documents. And I think the prospect of more litigation will be very helpful for understanding what effects these algorithms are having, and what the internal research these companies are doing or finding, and what are they ignoring. I think that'll be a pretty steady drumbeat, I think, in the near future, and might make the case for maybe more legislative intervention, although we'll see. Yeah, Pete?
Great, thanks. Yeah, really great presentations. My name's Pete. I'm from the Knight-Georgetown Institute as well. I'm curious how these studies that look like specifically at the feed in polarization, whether they take account for sort of broader extended use designs that kind of impact users' behavior on the platform. So for example, the case was about both algorithmic recommender systems, but also, the user interface, infinite scroll and autoplay, timing and clustering of notifications, and sort of intermittent variable rewards. Our colleague Brennan has done study on Netflix around sort of usage habits and autoplay. And I'm curious if like the totality of the interface and the sort of usage habits of the platform might influence, the sort of impacts of the recommender system on polarization as well.
So it's very possible. I'm not aware of studies focusing on the actual design on that on that type of features. I think most of study I look at in our study also focus only on the engagement-based recommendation, and we try to basically look at X at that time with that design. And that's the conclusion we can make. Changing the algorithm, changing the interface, the interaction between the two is something that we cannot really say, but it's definitely something that may have an impact and should be studied more.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think design-wise, doing these sort of experiments on a custom platform helps. So for example, the study that I was working on now, this is a platform that is not used outside of the experimental research. So that allows us then to play with these very specific things, So within those spaces, we can, for example, manipulate just whether you're anonymous or not, manipulate just whether you have a profile photo or not, and then test it. But of course, in doing so, you are taking away some of the ecological validity. And so they play different, I think, roles, right?
Yeah.
This allows us to get at the mechanisms, and then studies on actual platforms actually see whether these things are playing out in person.
Yeah, you're asking different questions in that case. And specifically in our case, we really wanted to ensure ecological validity. We wanted to see during election with this particular design, was there an effect if they change the algorithm or not? But yeah, the alternative would be to have a lab study. And,
that's where these experiments are so creative, and which is why I love them, because it's really hard to get at some of these things, because as you said, like there's so many pieces coming out. So that's what I love about this work, that we can, through labs or through other field experiments, get at these dimensions. It's a good question. Thank you.
On again? Okay, great. I want to ask maybe a bit of an somewhat annoying devil's advocate question responding to the transparency point. People disagree on this. Personally, I don't think about transparency as in and of itself a normative good. I think it's a good in what actions it facilitates. I've done a lot of work on AI documentation, and to date, most of the things that people thought AI documentation would achieve as instrumental goals have not been achieved through existing forms of AI documentation, in part because they're not legible, or there are organizational reasons why they're not produced well, or they weren't designed for any action or person in mind. So in the context of social media, what sorts of actions for any particular stakeholder group, whether that's a user or a policymaker or a researcher, what sorts of actions would transparency about these things ideally enable? And then with those outcomes in mind, what kinds of transparency artifacts or infrastructure, in your opinion, would actually enable those outcomes?
No, that's a great question. And I agree with you that it matters from sort of the sense of what it might lead to. So one example is we spend so many resources and time to get at things that seem like we should be able to know, like what was being shown, what's the engaging algorithm. Like we, spend years of work and so much money and everything to get at something that we should know. Now, why should we know that, right? Because with that information, then I can think about digital literacy intervention. I can think about how to make this part of education system so that people know, well, for example, they're on social media platforms, that it's a skewed signal, right? So I'm pitching now a project, so we'll see if it happens, but with this design studios that creates these creative little games of teaching teens of how algorithms work, right? So we can, if I know exactly what is being shown and how it works, then I can create these little tools where I can educate people and myself and others of how they should navigate that space, what are the pitfalls, and so on. So that's how I'm thinking about a transparency, that as a starting point for, again, education or these changes and so on, especially if you have transparency over time and you can see how it is. So that, but you're right that maybe we should think about what that transparency leads to and be a little bit more precise in how we're talking about transparency. I agree with that point.
Yeah, wanted to add, I think transparency is the first step for agency, because the first step, you want to surface what values and what are the reason is something is in your feed, so you could customize, you could have more control on your feed. And I think trust is coming through this chain. Transparency enable more control, more agency that can allow to have more trust in the system. Because when you build, it's also the broadly related to the IK effect. I make my feed, so I have more trust in what I see.
That's super helpful, but just to point out, both of you guys talked about sort of different aims that likely would require then different forms of transparency, which is like worth underscoring.
Absolutely.
I guess maybe a question for me along. Actually, we'll go to the audience. So yeah, go ahead.
Listening online, so was tracking a lot of things. I was wondering whether or not there's anybody thinking down the path that it's in fact the interface that is creating part of the problem, in the sense that if you think about reasoning, truth claims, argumentation, all these sorts of assertions, they are vying for mutual exclusivity. If this is true, that can't be true. When I'm arguing a point, I'm trying to carve out other things as untenable, and therefore, less credible, et cetera, whereas the interface and all of its vertical forms is entirely additive. It's entirely contributory. Please chime in anywhere, anytime. And so you end up with this very orthogonal use case. If you think about most of even your business applications, like anybody pile in, make a comment, be additive, be contributory. Whereas our claim space is like, no, you probably don't belong here. No, that's not good. No, you didn't substantiate, things like that. So there's a very different type of interface that if you were to mimic and think about our cognitive processes, would be fundamentally different than our additive behavioral, everybody pile in, everybody say their piece and chime in on the next guy kind of thing. Does that make sense as a?
I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, I think you are referring to the fact that many social media feel like a slot machine where you have a kind of addictive interface constantly running new content, and you need to constantly interact with it. And that's by design.
May I extend?
Yeah,
Like,
sure.
I think when I look at the polarization problem, and I come from the bridging world for multiple years, I go like, one of the reasons people are so frustrated is that their arguments don't work like they think they do. Like when I make an assertion, I'm making an assertion right now, right? I'm expecting to push things off the table and exclude things from your mind, et cetera, et cetera. But nothing in any of our computer interfaces, and I mean business applications as well as social media, replicates that cognitive process. It all is like, hey, somebody else can chime in and like, oh, because he was funnier than I was, he gets to the top. And like, this is just really benign human behavior in the way our minds work. But at the same time, it's fundamentally aggravating to anybody trying to argue anything. And I would dare say most online social media, like the thing that we call polarization, is somebody's trying to argue something.
I'm curious, what would in your, like flipping the question too, just because it's a really interesting point and I haven't thought about the actual interface in that way. What does the alternative to you look like that is more aligned with how we're cognitively
I had this conversation last year with some Wikipedia friends on like, how do you trace out this ideation and show, well, from the IP world, if I can borrow from patents, right? Like I am boxing things out, I'm carving claim sets, I'm inventorying, like the cognitive domain is a terrain that we're fighting over, hopefully civilly, but we at least, like, if I'm right, you can't be as right. And so somehow you have to synthesize, mimic that kind of aspect to it. I'm working on this project, of course. So like this is, you guys are experts in the field. And so I was definitely interacting on that.
It's making me think of, I think there's an increase now in all these deliberation platforms that are different separate spaces from the social media platforms and are have different ways of aggregating information. A lot of them sort of using AI now and what you will, which I think is getting closer a little bit to what you're talking about.
Like Polis and some of the other ones?
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's what comes to mind.
It's down the right path. Like in my exploration, I'm sorry to
No,
monopolize, is that they are really elaborate opinion consensus builders.
Yes.
You're trying to take an action. And cool, like, oh, you like this one and I like that one, and look at that, we both like ice cream. Wow, well, there's a point in common. But what I'm going for is belief coordination, not action coordination, belief coordination, to say like, you and I are right now, we're trying to get mental convergence on a thesis. Can AI help me do that? Help me learn like, oh, you meant this by that term, or whatever the countervailing is. But there's a whole cognitive element going on that right now is in my brain and your brain, and hopefully one day it's on the screen. Anyway, thank you very much for your.
No, this is great. And again, I was at a workshop on these deliberative platforms and I was surprised by how many there were, many that I haven't heard of before. So I can't say that there doesn't exist something like that, but there might not be. But I have a list of really interesting deliberative platforms that I learned about a few days ago. So I'll share them with you and then you can see if it fits.
Yeah.
All right. Do we have any other questions? All right.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting. I'm Liana Spasovska. I'm a fellow at the National Endowment for Democracy. And I wanted to ask whether the research design, within your research designs, actually you distinguish between organic polarization as an effect and between this intended and manufactured narratives that are sort of injected, and their primary aim is to have distrust and polarization as a direct product. Was this clear enough?
Yeah. In our study, we did not distinguish. We care about the outcome. So regardless of the source of the polarizing content, if it was even out party, in party, or manufactured or organic, we really care of what is the effect of that content. So it was not an objective within our study. But there is some work on that, trying to, in that case, I think it's something that should rely more on network property, like try to understand how this account was created, how it's connected, rather than the content itself, because I feel it's hard to distinguish an organic from an manufactured polarizing content without a full understanding of the user and the context.
Yeah, it's such an important question. It's so hard to do it with these designs. That definitely not something that I can speak to. I do ask them how much attention do they read the comments with sort of the, okay, comments is maybe more organic, but we know that also comments may not be organic and come from fake accounts and so on. So I think the literature on disinformation and misinformation, foreign influence operations, that they sort of do a little bit more on estimating how much of this is going on, but it's very hard. So yeah, I think in my paper, I can't really speak to what was organic versus not. I wish.
Yeah, I do believe there is, if is AI generated now, there are emerging technology to detect text generated with AI. So there may be something in that space, but yeah, it's beyond what we look in this study.
All right, any last lingering questions before I bring us to a close? All right, yeah, let's keep going.
Hello, thank you. Roberto Priora here. I was wondering, listening to you, very interesting, thank you. If there are indicators, like measurable indicators that a policymaker can use, like this social media is very polarizing, highly polarizing, or is totally inoffensive. Is there a way of measuring this in some way, putting figures to this problem? Thank you.
So you're saying how we can get some metric that can be actually used by policymakers.
Indeed, yeah.
Yeah, so what we found, yes, can concretely be used. So what I was saying before earlier is that we would need some structure constant assessment. So one-time experiment is kind of hard to be used to argue for a policy design. But if we have some architecture, and I encourage the research community to work on this, that can really constantly monitor the impact. For example, there is a work from actually this group, the Better Feed report that is a great reading, that also argue to look at the long term. How can we design some system to monitor the impact, not 1 week, but in the scope of 1 year or more. So putting in place all this sort of architecture, I think is the way to basically create something that policymaker can use.
Yeah, and I would say that I think you would need platforms to work with you to get something like that at that scale, right? We can do sort of these exercises, but to do it at this level, as Tiziano said, requires platforms being willing or being pushed to share some of that content, which is why I don't think that our research, I mean, it gives you a little bit of sense of there's this toxic content or misinformation, disinformation, but I don't know that it is as strong of a signal and that we can do it for as long of a time for it to be sort of a sustainable signal for policymakers.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Yeah, that's good.
Pete?
Thanks. Sorry for a follow-up question. But on that point as well, I mean, the government of Spain recently announced this plans to create a polarization footprint or demand a polarization footprint to actually compare and assess platforms. So regulators are certainly demanding that sort of.
Yeah, and also EU is working on the Democracy Shield, the initiative. So yeah, there is in EU especially, yeah, some attention to this.
Yes. I wanted to pick up on the second sort of recommendation for the future around like user agency and sort of choice and whether your work kind of speaks to the ways that could be operationalized. I remember a few years ago during the sort of exodus from X or Twitter to Blue Sky, I was in a room kind of like this where someone asked, you know, like who's using custom feeds on Blue Sky or who's just sort of using the default Discover feed, and almost everyone in the room was using the Discover feed, despite being like a very motivated group of individuals thinking about these issues. And the litigation has also sort of released some of the power of defaults around safety features on the platform. Like there's a table in some of the expert reports that shows that, you know, when it's a default safety feature on TikTok, it's, you know, 70–80% adoption. And when it's an opt-in feature, it's 1–2% adoption. So when you think about user agency around feeds, what would you like to see?
I mean, yeah, it's a great point, and it's reminding me of, I teach a class in social media and political behavior at the McCourt School of Public Policy, and I have students for 1 week write their own social media data report and track how they're using it, how it's making them feel, and so on. And they note, and I see also the discrepancy between what we say, how we use it, and how we want to use it, and then what's on the paper. So we use that as a moment of like realizing that, you know, maybe you're not opting in all these features that exist, and that we sort of agreed in the class that that's something that we want. What I would like to see is that default feeds are ones that are not addictive and engagement optimizing. So for that to be the default, and then for opt-in to be other options that you can, right? So flipping that. But one question is, what do we want to optimize for? What should that default be? And I think there, I would like to see truly more understanding from how regular citizens perceive it, because oftentimes our conversations in these spaces are different than, you know, if we took a national representative sample and people in different communities. And I feel like I still don't have a good sense of where the public is in terms of what sort of feed they would like to see. So I wouldn't say this is the one that I want. I would say that for the default to be something else. And I would love to hear from large samples outside of the spaces that I am of what are those values that they want.
Yeah, it's a very hard question. It's a question about design of platforms. So it's we have a paper recently that is exactly on this question. And the title is "Whose Value on Social Media?" And we realize asking people basically to even interpret the same post, the interpretation is completely different. So it's not only that there is a single interpretation of this post express some value or other values. So it's a very hard question, and I think we are at the beginning of understanding more about this. So I don't have a straight answer to this question, but I think we are working on that. So at least that's the good news.
I think maybe I'll chime in here too. I've done some work with our executive director, Alyssa Cooper, on writing about digital monocultures, right? Like everyone has the same default, right? Because these are markets are controlled by monopolies. And so one design is deployed for everyone. And I guess maybe you can imagine a world where like different people have different defaults. Like there's a default for children. There's a default for people interested in politics. There's a default for people interested in entertainment, right? And maybe that's where an element of user choice could come in. But I think that like when you have 80% of people being used for one design, it'll be at least like a race to the bottom, or at least common denominator, no matter what like design that you choose. So thinking about maybe more diversity would also be helpful for this as well. So other questions? All right.
Is there a fair amount of fair degree of like replicability between platforms, like holding like user demographics constant, or holding you know, like the context of the use case constant? Sounds like it's extremely inconsistent. Or is like to what extent is there any like consistency between like these?
So there is a consistent story, different order of magnitude, different facts, but the consistent story is that you see an effect on mental health and polarization. So what you can say is there are different studies that our study downrank some content, study that filter out content where you see that there is an effect on polarization. Like the most recent is the study of the pro-social ranking challenge that kind of add another piece to the puzzle where you see you start to understand that yes, there is a consistent story there. In terms of reproducing exactly, that's an hard problem, exactly because of all these difference in context, design platform, time. So it's hard to really end up with the same effect size if you repeat the experiment, especially in light of what I said earlier, that we ran this experiment 3 times, exactly the same. And one was consistent, but the other metric were actually impacted differently based on the emotional like change in that week.
Yeah, and I would say for the activation experiments, they started with just Facebook. First, because measuring compliance is easier. When people go off Facebook, we can actually see if they deactivated their profiles. But then my colleagues at Georgetown and NYU did also the activation on WhatsApp, and now we're doing it on 5 platforms, speaking to that question. And the patterns that are consistent tend to be around subjective well-being and news knowledge, and patterns that tend to be inconsistent or nulls, or I think there's more about the conditions are around polarization. So again, we have these activation studies on Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, but now the one I'm working on is going to be on 5 platforms. So we're working towards, I think, trying to answer that question. It's a hard one, but with more replications, we'll see what are some of the patterns that stick and what are context dependent. I just feel like we're not there yet. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll just draw attention to, it's interesting that when you pay people to not use social media, they feel better, yet people still continue using social media, and we should think about why that's the case. I think maybe we have time for 1, maybe 2 more questions. Anybody else? We have a hand in the back. Okay.
This is a little bit more meta,
Yes.
not the company, but I'm wondering where in the polarization universe, sorry, it's really loud, we're tracking on the information deluge as like this phenomenon that humanity has never walked through before. Like I think stats of like 30,000 YouTube hours posted per day or some number like that. And so I have that phenomena, like that's an exponential going on that invariably nobody's keeping up with their own stuff, let alone anybody else's. So like you have segmentation at least baked into the pie and getting worse and worse. Meanwhile, segmentation is also fundamental to any sort of media business model. Like a human attention is the absolute premium. Every single Marcom staff person in the 3-state area is trying to figure out how to get somebody to activate. And so there's a very like unstoppable force meets unmovable object kind of dilemma going on here. And I just would love to hear your reflections on that kind of super challenge to the overall picture, air quotes, polarization, air quotes. How do you moderate any of this and go like, oh yeah, this worldview is also represented or not? I don't know.
So to your last question, is the question more about moderation or just attention economy? I think it's very healthy to take some time off and reflect on what happens to you. I think there's a lot of power on online communities and spaces, especially if we live in more residentially segregated areas, you know, where we don't have as much exposure to the outgroup. I think it can be very powerful. I think going offline gives you a little bit of perspective of what are those productive uses or not. I use it all the time. When I find myself using it a lot more, I delete all the apps, and then after 2 weeks, I come refreshed and I can sort of, you know, so I think reflecting on our own usage and also using these insights from research of getting a sense of what is happening to you when you're seeing that, right? Like, okay, now I know why I'm seeing this content, because they really want me to click on this, because this is engaging and it speaks to this of my interests and this of my fears and so on. So I think having that be part of digital literacy training also from an earlier age, so that we have both the skills to think about this and are pushed to think about this more is, I think, very important now. So reflection, I guess, is my answer. But it's a very, I mean, that's one of the biggest problems of.
Doing is on like, what is the public epistemics?
Mhm,
Why do people believe? What do they know?
Mhm.
What's the, like,
Mhm.
this is upstream of democracy,
mhm,
right? It's a big deal. And so to that degree,
mhm.
these are some really heady
Absolutely.
kind of issues.
Yeah, I agree basically with this. So I don't think the way is to limit access in some way. Like you could say you could for children give some limited access to platform or something like this, or what is happening in Australia. I am not sure that's the right way to do it. I think it's more about the design. So pushing platform to have a design that may have other benefits embedded in the design of the algorithm. So it's you could like, for example, you know that TikTok has different designs. In the US is very different from China and other countries. So there is some design choice that you can make, still keeping the same logic of attention economy, but with different objectives. So I come from that side as a computer scientist. So I think there is something in the objective of the algorithm that can make a difference.
Okay. I think that's a good note to bring us to a close. If you can give our panelists a round of applause. I think this has been a great conversation. All right. Well, thank you for your time, everyone. We'll let you get to your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.